The night Colt Danner found her, he almost didn't stop. That was the thing he would carry longest. Not the rope marks on her wrists. Not the way her breathing sounded when he pressed his ear close to her face in the dark. Not even the weight of her in his arms, which was less weight than he expected. Less than a child her age should be. What he would carry was the 2 seconds he almost talked himself out of stopping. 200 other vehicles had passed that stretch of Highway 9 outside Grayfield, Tennessee, before Colt's Harley came around the bend. 200 pairs of headlights had swept across the tree line at the edge of Callaway Creek Road and seen whatever they saw and kept moving. It was a Wednesday night in October. People had places to be. People had warm houses and televisions and the particular comfort of not knowing what they didn't look at closely. Colt had none of those things anymore. He hadn't had them in 5 years. He was riding because he couldn't sleep, which was most nights now, but this week was worse than most. The anniversary fell on Saturday. 5 years since the call came from the hospital in Knoxville. 5 years since he'd been in Reno for club business 3 states away, unreachable by anything except the specific frequency of guilt that had been broadcasting inside his chest ever since. Sarah had been 4 years old. The other driver ran a red light on a Tuesday afternoon. Colt's ex-wife had been in surgery for 11 hours and survived. Sarah had not needed surgery. Sarah had not needed anything after that afternoon. He had spent 5 years trying to find the right way to live with that, and he had not found it. He had found the road instead. The road did not require anything from him, except that he keep moving, which suited him better than the alternative. So he was moving when his headlights swept across the color. It was pink. A child's color against all that October brown and dark green. A flash of it maybe 50 yards into the tree line, barely visible through the undergrowth. The kind of thing you only caught at the right angle, for the right fraction of a second. Colt had already begun to lean back into the road when something made him straighten. Something older than thought. Something that had been built into him by the same years that had broken other parts. He eased off the throttle. He pulled to the shoulder. He sat there for a moment with the engine idling and the night sounds coming back in around the motor noise. Crickets. The creek somewhere below the road. The cooling tick of metal. He looked at the tree line. He could not see the color anymore from this angle. Maybe it had been nothing. Probably it had been nothing. Colt swung his leg over the seat and walked toward the trees. The undergrowth was thick enough that his leather jacket caught twice before he was 10 feet in. He moved carefully. Not because he was afraid he had not been afraid of the dark since he was 12 years old, and had decided there was nothing in it worse than what was already inside him. He moved carefully because something in the quality of the silence ahead of him was asking for it. The way a room goes quiet when something in it is very wrong. The way you stop moving fast when you don't yet know what you're moving toward. 20 feet in, he saw her. She was sitting against the trunk of an old white oak, her small back against the bark, her arms pulled behind the tree at an angle that told him immediately before any of his other observations caught up that she was not sitting there by choice. She was 5 years old, maybe 6. Blonde hair, dirty and tangled with leaves. She was wearing a pink t-shirt, the source of the color he had caught in his headlight, and a pair of shorts that were wrong for October in Tennessee. No shoes. Her feet were scratched and muddy in a way that told him she had not been there simply sitting. She had been there struggling. He moved toward her. She did not respond to his footsteps, did not lift her head. He crouched down in front of her and brushed the hair back from her face with one hand, and the other instinct found her wrist. even before he could process what his eyes were showing him. Her pulse was there, faint and fast, like a small engine running on almost nothing, but it was there. He looked at her wrists. The rope was knotted tight enough that it had broken the skin. Both wrists behind the tree bound separately and then wrapped together. The knots were not accidental. Someone who knew what they were doing had put those knots there. Someone who had thought about this. Colt sat back on his heels and looked at her for a moment. This small, unconscious child, tied to a tree in the dark in October, with no shoes on her feet. The thing building inside him was not describable as a simple emotion. It was older than that. It was the thing that moved before thinking when you saw something that should not exist in a world with any order to it at all. He pulled the hunting knife from his boot. The first rope gave quickly once he found the angle. He moved her freed arm gently to her side. The skin underneath was marked in deep red, the kind of mark that would take days to fade. He worked on the second binding slower now, more careful, because her arm had gone stiff, and he did not want to jolt her back into consciousness while he was still working. The second rope fell away and he caught both her arms before they could drop. He checked her breathing again, shallow, the way breathing got when the body had been through too much and had decided to step back from the immediate situation and manage things from a safer distance. Colt stood up with her in his arms. She weighed almost nothing. That was the thing he had not been prepared for. He had carried hurt animals in his life, had lifted machinery and engines and unconscious grown men out of bad situations. He had not held a child in 5 years, and he had forgotten how little space a child occupied, how completely they trusted the arms that held them even when they were unconscious and could not choose their trust. He carried her back through the trees to the road. There was nobody on Highway 9 in either direction. He stood on the shoulder with her against his chest and thought through his options in the direct and practical way he had learned to think through options in situations where thinking too long was its own kind of failure. The nearest hospital was 15 miles back in Grayfield. The hospital meant police. Police meant a man with a Hells Angels patch on his back, no current identification on his person, and a history that would raise every flag available, raising them simultaneously the moment someone ran his name. The hospital was not a place where this ended well for either of them. Agnes Whitfield lived 11 miles the other direction. Agnes was 73 years old and had spent 30 years as an emergency room nurse at Grayfield General before her hip forced her out of the work she had loved and into the quiet of a house on Ridgeline Road that smelled of herbal tea and the specific peace of a woman who had seen enough emergencies to stop being frightened by them. She had patched Colt up twice in the years he had been coming through Grayfield. She had never asked him anything he didn't want to answer. She was the closest thing to someone he trusted completely. He secured the child against him with one arm and mounted the Harley and made it to Agnes's house in 9 minutes. The porch light was on. It was always on. Agnes had told him once that she kept it on because there was no such thing as a predictable hour for someone needing help. He cut the engine in the driveway and the front door opened before he reached the steps. Agnes stood in the doorway in her housecoat, silver hair loose around her face, and she looked at what he was carrying and she pulled the door wide and said, "Come in." And that was all she said for the first 2 minutes. Because she was already moving, already thinking, already doing what 30 years of ER nursing had built into her. The accumulated weight of 3 decades of arriving at the worst moments and knowing exactly what to do with them. He laid the child down on the floral sofa in Agnes's living room. Agnes knelt beside her without kneeling. the way other people knelt. Which was to say, she knelt with purpose, with efficiency, her hands already finding the child's pulse, and her eyes already running the assessment Colt had not been trained to make. She checked the pupils. She checked the rope marks. She checked the temperature of the child's skin and the color of her lips and the child's breathing, and she reached for the first aid kit that lived on the second shelf of the bookcase. Because Agnes Whitfield had long since accepted that the world would keep sending her situations regardless of whether she was on the clock. Colt stood against the far wall with his hands at his sides. He was a large man in a small woman's living room, and he was aware of it in the way he was always aware of the space he occupied, always conscious of how much room he took up in places that were not built for men who looked like him. The flowered quilts and the frame prints and the lamps with the beaded shades all looked at him, the way they always did, with the mild confusion of domestic objects that had not been designed to coexist with something so deliberately hard. She found it, Agnes said quietly, and he crossed the room. She was pointing to a place on the child's upper arm, half hidden by the sleeve of the pink t-shirt. A small circular mark puckered at the center, old enough to have healed to a scar. She pointed to a second place on the child's back, visible when Agnes had checked the girl's spine. A bruise already yellowing at the edges, the color of something that had happened at least a week before tonight. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable if you knew what you were looking at, the shadow of an older bruise from further back. "This has been going on a while," Agnes said. She said it the way she said everything, without drama, which was actually the most damning way to say it. Colt looked at the child on the sofa. She was pale in the lamplight. Her blonde hair spread across the cushion where Agnes had arranged it. Her wrists were now wrapped in clean bandaging. She had been bathed gently while Colt waited on the porch smoking a cigarette he did not remember lighting. Agnes had changed her into an oversized shirt that swallowed her small frame. He looked at the rope marks, even through the bandaging, knowing what was under there, knowing what someone's hands had done to put those marks in that specific pattern on a child's wrists. "Who found her?" "Garrett Briley," Agnes said. She had made calls while he waited outside. "That's what the records show. He filed for guardianship 8 months ago when her parents died in that car accident on Route 41. She paused. "He lives out on Meridian Road." Colt already knew what he was going to do when she said that. He had known from the moment Agnes identified the old bruise, from the moment the picture organized itself into the only shape that made sense. He had been in enough situations to know when the facts added up to one answer. And the answer here was that a child in the custody of a man had been hurt in a pattern over time. And that man had a name and an address, and Colt had both. He would wait until she was stable. He would wait until morning, which was only a few hours away. And then he would go to Meridian Road. The child's eyes opened just before 4 in the morning. Colt was in the armchair nearest the sofa when it happened. He had not slept. He was not capable of sleeping, not in rooms he did not know well, not in conditions he could not fully read. And the condition of this room included an unconscious child whose status he could not predict. So he sat and waited, and Agnes moved in and out with tea and quiet words and the competence of someone who had done this, or something close enough to it, more times than she could count. The child's eyes opened and found the ceiling first, the way eyes did when consciousness returned before orientation, when the brain was logging basic sensory data before committing to the larger question of where and what and why. Then they moved around the room, the bookcase, the lamp, the window with its dark curtains, Agnes in the chair by the door, and then finally Colt. She did not look afraid of him. That was the thing he had not expected. He was a large man with a beard and a scar over his left eyebrow, and the distinctive leather vest of an organization that most people in small towns in Tennessee associated with exactly the kind of trouble they crossed the street to avoid. Children were not generally the demographic that looked at him and felt reassured. Children usually looked at him the way adults tried not to. This child looked at him the way you looked at someone you had already decided to trust, before you had enough information to make that decision logically, which meant she had made the decision on something other than logic. And whatever that was, it had led her to him. He didn't move. He kept his hands visible on the arms of the chair and waited. She looked at him for a long time. Then she held out her hand. The gesture was so small and so direct that it took him a moment to understand what it was. A child reaching for a stranger. Not because she didn't know he was a stranger, because she had decided it didn't matter. Colt looked at her hand, and then at her face. And then he unfolded from the armchair and crossed to the sofa and lowered himself onto the edge of the cushion. Careful and slow. Careful about his weight and the jostling in every one of the ways a body his size could accidentally cause harm. Her fingers were tiny against his palm. Bird bones. The specific fragility of a child's hand when you were not accustomed to holding one. "What's your name?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said a word so quiet he had to lean closer to catch it. "Lily," she said. He let that sit between them. "Lily," he said. "All right." She nodded. Her eyes moved to the bandaging on her wrists and then back to his face, with the expression of a child running a calculation, deciding how much of the current situation she understood and what to do with her understanding. He asked her what happened. The change in her was subtle. Not fear exactly, at least not new fear. Something more like the stillness of a person accessing a memory that their body has already cataloged as dangerous. Her fingers tightened around his, and she was quiet for longer than he expected from a 5-year-old. Then she said 7 words. Not Uncle Garrett. Aunt Sylvia. Colt sat with those 7 words. He had been preparing in the part of himself that prepared for things while the rest of him was doing other things to go to Meridian Road. He had been building a version of Garrett Briley in his mind from the available evidence. A man who left a child in his care and went out. A man who came back to find her gone and reported nothing. A man with a record, whatever that record was. He had been building the architecture of confrontation, which was something Colt was practiced at, something he had walked into enough times to have a clear picture of how it unfolded. Not Uncle Garrett. Aunt Sylvia. He sat with those words and felt the architecture dissolve. "Where is Aunt Sylvia?" he said. He kept his voice the same, level and quiet. Nothing in it that would make the child feel the need to take back what she had said. "She lives with us," Lily said. "She stays at the house." He looked at her face. He had learned to read people the way some people learn to read rooms or weather. He had grown up in situations where the ability to tell the difference between what someone was saying and what they meant was a survival skill. He looked at this child's face and he saw what was there. She was not lying. She was not confused. She was 5 years old and she was tired, and she had a bruise under her shirt that was a week old and rope marks on her wrists, and she was telling him the truth, with the flat calm of a person for whom certain facts had long since stopped being shocking and had simply become the furniture of her days. He would go to Meridian Road. but not for the reason he had originally planned. He stayed with Lily until she fell back asleep, which took less than 10 minutes. She kept hold of his finger until she couldn't anymore, until the weight of her exhaustion pulled her hand down to the cushion, and her breathing slowed into the deeper rhythm of genuine rest. He extracted his hand carefully and stood and went to the kitchen where Agnes was sitting at the table, with 2 cups of coffee she had not asked if he wanted. He sat down and told Agnes what Lily had said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Garrett Briley filed the guardianship paperwork himself. There's no mention of a girlfriend or partner in the court records. Whoever this woman is, she's not legally documented as having any role in that household. Colt wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, which means Agnes said that every time someone looked at how Lily was being cared for, they were looking at Garrett. They were not looking at anyone else. He drove to Meridian Road at 7 in the morning. The house was a small ranch-style place set back from the road, with a gravel driveway and a rusted mailbox with the flag up. A pickup truck sat beside the house. Its paint was faded, and one of the rear taillights was duct-taped over. The yard wasn't kept up, but it wasn't aggressively neglected either. It was the yard of a person who had too many other things taking up his attention to think much about grass. Colt parked at the end of the driveway and walked to the door. He had a picture in his mind of what was going to happen. He had knocked on enough doors with bad intentions to know how these scenes ran. The man opens the door. He reads the situation wrong or reads it right, and it doesn't matter either way. Things accelerate from there to a conclusion. He knocked. The door opened faster than he expected. The man on the other side was 38 years old, maybe with 3 days of stubble, and the kind of eyes that had not slept recently. He was wearing a work shirt with a name patch on the left chest that said Garrett, and he had the build of someone who did physical labor thick through the shoulders with calloused hands. He looked at Colt, and he did not look like a man who had done something and was waiting to be caught. He looked like a man who had been waiting by the door for someone to come and tell him something. "Is she alive?" Garrett said. That was the first thing he said. "Is she alive?" Colt looked at him. "Yes," he said. Garrett's knees bent slightly, and he put one hand against the door frame. His face did something complicated, a sequence of things, the held breath releasing, and behind it, underneath it, a grief that had been sitting there for longer than the past 12 hours. "I've been looking since last night," Garrett said. "Called everyone I know." His voice was rough and low. "Where is she? Is she hurt?" "She's with someone who knows how to care for her," Colt said. "She's been hurt." Garrett's expression hardened, but it hardened in a direction Colt had not expected. Not defensively. Inward. The way a person's face hardened when they were absorbing confirmation of something they already knew. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house was cleaner than the outside suggested. A kitchen to the right. A living room with a couch and a television and a child's drawings pinned to the wall. Crayon drawings of houses and stick figures in a yellow sun with too many rays. The way children always drew the sun. Colt looked at the drawings. He looked at the space where a child lived and could tell what he always could tell, which was that someone had tried to make it good for her. Garrett sat on the couch without asking Colt to sit. His hands were between his knees and he was looking at the floor. "Lily told me it was Sylvia," Colt said. The silence that followed was different from the silences that preceded confessions. Colt had been in rooms with men who had done terrible things, and he knew the texture of that silence. This was not it. This was the silence of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time, and who had just discovered there was another person in the room with him who now knew part of the weight. "How long?" Colt said. Garrett raised his head. "I started noticing things about 4 months ago. Before that, I thought it was the adjustment. Lily's not been right since her parents died." He paused. Who could blame her for that? He stopped again. "But then I started seeing things." He looked at his hands. Marks I couldn't explain. The way she'd go still when Sylvia walked into a room. "And you let it happen," Colt said. Garrett looked at him with the eyes of a man who had been asking himself that exact question for 4 months. "I tried to stop it," Garrett said. "I told Sylvia that things needed to change. She told me I was misreading a difficult kid and overreacting." He shook his head slowly. "And the thing is, she's very good at making you believe that. She's very good at making you feel like the problem is your perception." Colt said nothing. "I called Child Protective Services," Garrett said. 6 weeks ago." Colt went still. Someone came out to the house. Garrett's voice was flat. Sylvia had been expecting it somehow. House was perfect. Lily was dressed like a picture in a magazine. The woman from CPS sat with Sylvia for 40 minutes and left with a form that said, "Insufficient evidence." He paused. 3 weeks later, I tried again. Different office, same county. He looked up at Colt. The second one never got opened. I found out later it was marked received and then just... He spread his hands. "Gone." "How does a report go missing?" Colt said. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Sylvia works for Aldrich and Park," he said. "Biggest law firm in Grayfield. She's been there for 8 years. She knows people in every county office. She knows people on the bench." He said it without anger now, in the tone of a man describing geography. "She spent years building that. I didn't understand it while it was happening. I didn't understand what she was building." Colt looked at him for a long time. Garrett Briley was not a man who had hurt this child. He was a man who had been outmaneuvered by someone who was better at a particular kind of strategy than he was in a system that rewarded the appearance of respectability above all other evidence. He was a man with a record and a rough face and a faded pickup in the driveway. And she was a woman with a law firm behind her and a church attendance record and photographs at community events. And the system had looked at those two things and seen exactly what she had designed it to see. Colt knew something about being the version of the story that the system automatically believed was the problem. He drove back to Agnes's house in the late morning. Agnes was in the garden when he arrived, deadheading the autumn mums with the focused attention she brought to everything. She looked up when she heard his motorcycle. She read his face, which was a thing she had gotten good at in their acquaintance, and she set down the shears and came inside. She confirmed the records Agnes said when he had told her about Garrett. Her contact at the county had made some calls. No opened case file on Lily Briley. One received report flagged inactive moved to a secondary queue, where it had been sitting for 3 weeks untouched. Who flags a received report inactive before it's even assessed? Agnes asked. Someone who knows the system well enough to know where to put pressure, Colt said. Agnes nodded. He called Garrett that afternoon and asked him one question before they moved. He asked about the key. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said that yes, he still had a key to Sylvia's house. He had lived there for 4 months before moving back to Meridian Road. He had never returned the key because there had been no clean moment to return it. No natural end to the arrangement that had called for a formal key returning. He had simply moved back out, and the key had stayed on his ring. That key, Colt said, is evidence that you had authorized access to the property. Garrett understood. They met at the end of Sycamore Lane at 9:15 Thursday morning while Sylvia was at work. The neighborhood was quiet on a weekday. Most houses showed the stillness of places whose occupants had left for the day. A dog barked once from a yard 2 houses down and stopped. Colt had gone through the plan on the drive over, running it the way he ran every plan, looking for the places where it could fail, and deciding in advance what he would do when those places arrived. The key gave them legal access. Garrett had lived in the house for 4 months, which established a prior relationship with the property. They were not taking anything. They were not damaging anything. They were looking. Garrett unlocked the back door, and they went in. The inside of Sylvia Mercer's house was the inside of a performance. That was the word Colt used to himself when he had been standing in it for 30 seconds. Every surface said something. The arrangement of the kitchen counter said organization. The framed certificates on the hallway wall said accomplishment. The photographs on the bookcase in the living room said warmth, said community investment, said a woman who showed up for the things that mattered to the people around her. Colt moved through the space, slowly reading it, the way you read a scene, looking not at what was presented, but at what the presentation was trying to do. He went to the home office first. It was a small room off the hallway, a desk and a filing cabinet, and a bookcase with legal reference texts. The desk was clear except for a lamp and a notepad. The filing cabinet had a lock, but the lock was a basic 3-digit model. And Colt had been picking locks of that category since before Garrett was born. It took 4 minutes. The hanging files inside were labeled in Sylvia's handwriting, which was neat and consistent, and looked the same on every tab. The handwriting of someone who applied equal attention to small details regardless of their apparent importance. Financial files, insurance documents, property records, professional references, and a thicker folder near the back labeled in the same neat hand. Briley G. Colt lifted it out and set it on the desk. Garrett had come to stand in the doorway. He looked at the folder with the expression of a man who was not entirely surprised to see his own name on a file in another person's cabinet, but had not quite committed to believing what that meant until this moment. There were photographs first. Colt went through them carefully. Most showed Garrett in situations that, out of context, looked bad. A photograph of Garrett in a parking lot at night, talking to 2 other men that could be construed as a transaction of some kind, depending on what story you put around it. A photograph of Garrett's front door with the trash cans out on the wrong day, which could be described as evidence of an unprepared living environment. A printout of his criminal record, including 2 assault charges from 11 years ago, that had been reduced to disorderly conduct and 1 DUI from 8 years prior, that he had completed the requirements for without incident. Ordinary documentation. If you were a person with a rough history. Carefully assembled documentation. If you were someone preparing a case. Then, the written material. There were 3 pages of handwritten notes. Colt read them standing at the desk. Not sitting, not relaxing into the reading, standing the way he stood. When the information was the kind that needed to go directly into the part of the brain that processed actions, rather than the part that processed feelings. The notes were a narrative. They described incidents. An occasion when Lily had been observed with bruising that Garrett had been unable to explain to neighbors. An occasion when Lily had reportedly told a school aide that she was scared to go home. an occasion when Garrett had reportedly been seen in an argument with Lily in the front yard grabbing her arm. These incidents had dates attached to them. The dates were specific. Some of them predated situations that Colt now knew had different explanations. She had been building this file for months. She had been building a version of Garrett Briley that presented to a court with the right supporting testimony from the right credible witnesses would make a judge's decision simple. Not Sylvia's word against Garrett's, Sylvia's documentation, Sylvia's witnesses, Sylvia's 10 years of community presence against a man with a record and no resources and no one who could speak effectively on his behalf. Colt photographed every page in the folder. He moved to the desk drawer. It was not locked. Inside was a notebook with a soft cover, the kind sold in any drugstore, and he opened it and read the first page and understood immediately what he was holding. Sylvia kept records, not the organized files of the cabinet, but a different kind of record, a personal one written for herself, rather than for presentation. The entries were dated going back 14 months, and they described Lily in language that was not the language of a caretaker, describing a child in their care. It was the language of a warden describing a problem. It was the language of someone who had decided that the relationship between herself and this child was fundamentally corrective, that Lily was a thing that required management, and that the methods of management were not something she felt the need to apologize for, because she was correct in applying them. He read 2 months of entries. He photographed every page of the notebook. He found one more thing in the desk drawer beneath the notebook, a printed document, 2 pages legal language. He read it and looked at Garrett in the doorway and held it up without speaking. Garrett looked at the pages. His face did not change dramatically. It made the small, controlled change of a person absorbing confirmation of a thing they feared. It was a guardianship transfer document. Garrett's name on the relinquishing line. Sylvia's name on the receiving line. Blank signature blocks. The document had been prepared by a legal professional. The formatting was correct. The language was precise. It had been prepared and printed and placed in a drawer, ready to be presented at the moment when Garrett was ready to sign it, or when circumstances had been arranged to make his signature the path of least resistance. The date on the document was 3 weeks old. Garrett Colt said, and waited until Garrett met his eyes. "Did she ever show you this?" Garrett shook his head. "But she told you it existed. She told me she had paperwork ready." Garrett said, "If I decided to do what she was asking." Colt put the document back in the drawer exactly where he had found it. He took photographs of it first. They left the house through the back door the same way they had come in. Garrett locked it behind him. They walked back to the street without hurrying, because the cardinal error in these situations was to let urgency become visible in your body before the situation required it. In the truck, Colt transferred the photographs to a secondary device he kept for this purpose. Then he called Agnes and asked her to make another set of her medical observations about Lily's injuries, this time organized chronologically with the oldest injuries listed first, and the estimate of each injury's age stated clearly. Agnes said she would have it ready by noon. He spent the early afternoon watching the house on Sycamore Lane from the cross street, waiting for Sylvia to return from work. She arrived home at 5:15 in a silver sedan backed into the driveway with the careful precision of someone who did everything in the observable world with care. She was dressed for the office, composed. She moved up the walk with the precision of someone who had decided that every observable detail of her public presentation was part of a project she was always working on. She smiled at the neighbor across the street as she unlocked her front door. The neighbor waved back, At 6:30, a woman arrived with a boy of about 5, a play date or a sitting arrangement. Sylvia greeted them at the door with that same warm smile, the one that reached her eyes in the practiced way of someone who had learned to make it reach her eyes. The woman left. The boy followed Sylvia inside. For 45 minutes, everything was quiet. Then an upstairs window was open and Colt heard her voice. He had not been expecting to hear it. He had been watching, not listening. And then the voice cut through the evening air, and he understood in the way that certain sounds reorganize your understanding of a situation. That what he was hearing was not the version of Sylvia Mercer that the neighbor had waved to. "What is wrong with you?" the voice said. It was cold in the way that cold was different from loud. It was the temperature of something that had decided not to need the additional force of volume. "You do something this stupid, and then you look at me like that." Colt got out of his truck. He moved to the side of the house where the window was open, staying below the sight line. Through the glass above him, the voice continued, not raising, just descending in temperature. "Stand in the corner. Don't say a word until I tell you to." He heard nothing from the boy. That was the part that stayed with him later. Not the words, though the words were damning. It was the silence of the child. A silence that was not the silence of a child processing a situation. It was the silence of a child who had learned not to make sound in certain conditions, because sound had consequences. He stood against the side of the house and he took out his phone and he held it up to the open window. He recorded 40 seconds of her voice. Then he walked back to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat and looked at the recording on his phone. 40 seconds. Proof of a mask. Proof that the warm woman at the door and the voice through the window were the same person, which was not the same as proof of what she had done to Lily. But it was the beginning of something. The first brick of a structure that would need to be built carefully and without gaps. He called Agnes. He told her what he had recorded. Agnes was quiet, and then she said that she had been looking through the medical records she kept, and that she wanted Colt to come back, that she had found something he needed to see. When he got back to the house, Agnes had a folder on the kitchen table. She had written down everything she had observed when she examined Lily Date's locations of injuries, estimates of age of bruising based on coloration. In nursing, she said, "You documented everything you saw, because you never knew what would matter later." She had written 5 pages. Each page was careful and specific in the way of someone who had spent 30 years documenting things in ways that would hold up to scrutiny. "The burn mark," Agnes said, "on her arm. The shape and depth of it is consistent with a small metal cylinder." She paused. "Like a cigarette lighter. A round one. The kind that gets hot." Colt looked at the page. "This was done deliberately," Agnes said. "Not accidentally. And it was done more than once." She pointed to a secondary area on the other arm he had not noticed in the dark. Same diameter. Older by several months. He sat at the table and thought about Sylvia Mercer's voice through the open window. And then he thought about that burn mark. And then he thought about the hinge between those two things. The mechanism that connected a woman who spoke to children. The way Sylvia had spoken to that boy. To a woman who pressed hot metal against a 5-year-old's skin. The mechanism was simple. She believed she had the right to. "People like this," Agnes said, "they don't think they're doing something wrong. They think they're correcting something." She folded her hands on the table. "And that makes them more dangerous than people who know they're doing wrong because they don't stop." That evening, after Lily had eaten and fallen asleep, Colt sat on Agnes's back porch and went through Garrett's phone. Garrett had given it to him without asking why, which was either trust or desperation or some combination of the two that Colt didn't have energy to distinguish between. He went through the messages chronologically, starting from 8 months before the month. Garrett filed for guardianship of Lily. Sylvia's messages in the early months were warm, affectionate, encouraging. She had congratulated Garrett on taking responsibility for his niece. She had offered to help, to be there, to make the transition easier. She had, reading between the lines, positioned herself as a partner in this, as someone whose investment in Lily's welfare was equal to Garrett's own. The tone shifted around month 4, subtly at first. Small comments about Lily's behavior. The child is difficult. The child is manipulative. Children who have been through trauma are not always grateful for what they are given. There was a language being established gradually that reframed Lily from a child who needed care into a child who was a problem to be managed. By month 6, the messages were different again. Colt read them twice to make sure he understood what he was reading. Sylvia had sent Garrett paperwork. Not physical paperwork, not yet, but descriptions of paperwork. Legal language about guardianship transfer arrangements. Language about what would happen to the insurance benefit from Lily's parents if Garrett was found unfit. Language about what a man with Garrett's specific history could expect if a detailed complaint about his fitness as a guardian were filed with the appropriate authorities. And then, the line that made everything else make sense. I've drawn up a simple arrangement, she had written. You transfer primary legal guardianship to me. When Lily comes of age and the insurance trust releases, we divide it equally. You get $200,000, you walk away from a situation that was never going to work for someone with your background. Think about it. It's the cleanest solution for everyone. Garrett had not replied to that message. There was a silence in the thread for 6 days after it was sent. Then Garrett had written, I need time. Sylvia had written back, you have a week. The timestamps placed that exchange 3 days before the night. Colt had found Lily tied to a tree. He put the phone down on the porch railing and looked at the dark yard. The insurance policy. He had not known about the insurance policy until this moment. He had built a picture of what Sylvia Mercer was from her voice through a window from Agnes's medical notes, from the cold architecture of her messages to Garrett. He had thought he understood the shape of the thing. Now the shape had a different dimension. It had money in it. $400,000 sitting in a trust, waiting for Lily to come of age. And Sylvia Mercer had decided she did not want to wait. The rope on the tree. The location deep enough into the woods that someone might not find her for days. The weather in October, which in Tennessee at night dropped into the 40s. A 5-year-old dehydrated already with rope marks that had been cutting off circulation for hours. Sylvia had not been punishing Lily that night. She had not lost control. She had made a calculation. She had looked at Garrett's silence, his refusal to respond to her proposal, and she had decided to remove the variable. If Lily did not survive the night in those woods, the insurance trust would eventually process to its next designated beneficiary. If Garrett could subsequently be implicated in whatever had happened to Lily through the haze of accusations and a record, and the kinds of witnesses Sylvia could assemble the legal path to, that money became considerably shorter. Colt sat on Agnes Whitfield's back porch in Grayfield, Tennessee, and understood that he was not dealing with a woman who had hurt a child out of cruelty or frustration, or any of the ordinary terrible human reasons that children got hurt. He was dealing with a woman who had planned this. He went inside and sat beside Lily's bed in the dark, and listened to her breathe, which was steadier now. which was deeper and more even than it had been the night before, which was the sound of a body deciding it had reason to recover. Her hand was curled near her face on the pillow. The bandaging on her wrists showed white in the dim light from the hallway. 5 years ago, he had been in Reno when he should have been in Knoxville. He was here now. He was staying. He was parked outside Agnes's house, still in the truck after transferring the photographs from the house visit when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He answered it anyway because he answered numbers he didn't recognize because, in his experience, the things you least expected were often the things that mattered most. The voice on the other end identified itself as belonging to a Deputy Fletcher of the Grayfield Sheriff's Department. It told him that a complaint had been filed regarding the whereabouts of a minor child named Lily Briley. It told him that the complaint described 2 men, one of whom matched Colt's description, as having taken the child without authorization. It told him that he was requested to come in for a voluntary conversation at the department's convenience. Voluntary, Colt said. "That's correct," the deputy said. At this time, he asked if he needed to bring anything. "Just yourself," the deputy said. "Today, if possible." After he hung up, he sat in the truck for a moment and thought about the word voluntary and the phrase at this time and what the interval between those 2 things represented in practical terms. He went inside and told Agnes. Agnes listened, and then she said, "She knows Lily is alive. She's setting the narrative before anyone else can." "Yes," Colt said. Agnes sat down at her kitchen table. Lily was in the living room, visible through the doorway, sitting on the floor with the stuffed animals Agnes had produced from somewhere upstairs, arranging them in a configuration that appeared to have specific logic Lily was not sharing. She was talking to one of the animals quietly. She was talking more now in the 3rd day since he had found her than she had in the 1st. Small things, observations, questions delivered in the way of a child who was not certain the questions would be welcome but was asking them anyway. She would need to hear what was about to happen. Not in detail. Not in the language Colt was using in his own head, which was the language of logistics and legal exposure and tactical positioning. But in the language of things are going to happen in the next few days that are going to feel uncertain. And she needed to know that uncertainty was not the same as unsafe. He went into the living room and sat down on the floor near her, the way he had started to sit close, but not crowded, present, but not pressing. "Some people are going to be making decisions about where you live," he said. "For a little while, it's going to seem like a lot is happening. But I want you to know that you're not going back to Sylvia's house." Lily looked at him. The animal she had been talking to was a rabbit, old and soft, one ear stitched where it had been repaired. She held it in both hands and looked at Colt, and she was quiet for a moment. "Do you promise?" she said. Colt looked at her. He had made promises in his life that he had not kept. Not because he had intended not to keep them, but because the world had not cooperated with his intentions. He knew something about the weight of a promise made to a child, about what it cost a child when that promise failed to hold, about what it cost the person who made it. "Yes," he said, "I promise." She looked at him for another moment. Then she went back to arranging the animals. Colt went to the sheriff's department that afternoon. Deputy Fletcher was 26 years old and had the look of someone who had been told to do something he was not entirely comfortable doing, and was doing it anyway because his job required it. He was professional and careful, and he asked his questions in a sequence that told Colt immediately what the complaint had said. The questions were structured around the assumption that a child had been taken from the care of her legal guardian without authorization. The guardian in question was Sylvia Mercer, who had filed the complaint that morning, who had described herself as the primary caretaker of the child, in the absence of the child's uncle. who had been, she said, incapacitated by substance use and unable to fulfill his guardianship responsibilities. Colt answered the deputy's questions in the same level voice he used for everything, giving information in the precise quantities required, and not more. He acknowledged that Lily was in his care. He described the circumstances under which he had found her, giving only the factual details and leaving the interpretive work to the deputy. He provided Agnes Whitfield's name and address and professional credentials and described her role. He said that the child had received medical care and was stable and was not in danger. He did not tell the deputy about the folder in Sylvia's filing cabinet. He did not tell him about the notebook. He was not yet ready to put those things into a system where Sylvia had relationships he couldn't fully map. The deputy wrote everything down and told Colt he was free to go for now. The phrase "for now" did a lot of work. He called Renata Haynes from the parking lot of the sheriff's department. He had not spoken to Renata in 2 years. The last time had been a brief call to confirm that her brother was doing well, which was a call he made every year on the anniversary of the night. He had pulled Declan Haynes out of a parking lot behind the Rusty Nail Bar in Grayfield before 3 men who had followed him from inside could finish what they had started. Declan had been 22 and making bad choices, and the men behind the bar had not been interested in his reasons. Colt had been passing through and had paused because pausing was a thing he did now, and he had intervened, and it had taken about 4 minutes. And afterward, Renata Haynes, who had arrived in time to see the last of it, had looked at him and said, "If you ever need anything, I owe you more than I can pay." He had never called in that debt. He was calling it now. Renata was a family law attorney in Grayfield, 47 years old, with a practice built primarily on custody and guardianship cases. She listened to everything he told her without interrupting, which was a professional skill. But also he had the sense just the way she was. She asked 3 clarifying questions when he finished all of them sharp and specific, the questions of someone who had already identified the load-bearing walls of the situation and was checking them. Then she said, "Sylvia Mercer works for Aldrich and Park." "Yes," Colt said. "George Aldrich sits on the board of the Family Services Oversight Committee for this county." She paused. "Which means he has relationships with the people who supervise the CPS intake process." "I figured it was something like that," Colt said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You understand what we're up against." He understood. "Tell me what you have," she said. He told her. The insurance document, the transfer paperwork, the messages on Garrett's phone, the notebook, Agnes's medical documentation, the video recording from the window. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "The phone messages are your strongest piece. If they establish financial motive in Sylvia's own words, that changes the character of everything else. The notebook is corroborating. Agnes's documentation is essential. The video is atmospheric but useful." "What about the CPS reports going missing?" Colt said. "That's harder to prove and easier for her side to explain away," Renata said. "We don't lead with that. We let it be context, something the court can see the shape of when the primary evidence is already on the table." "They're going to file for an emergency custody order," she said. "Probably today or tomorrow. Sylvia's attorney will argue that the child is currently in unauthorized care and that the legal guardian has been falsely characterized. They'll point to Garrett's record. They'll argue for immediate return to Sylvia's custody pending investigation. And a judge might sign it," Colt said. "If the judge is familiar with Sylvia Mercer through professional channels, yes. It's possible." Renata's voice was even. "I'm going to file a motion to intervene. I'm going to request a full evidentiary hearing before any emergency order is executed. Whether we get it depends on who's assigned." When he got back to Agnes's house, it was late afternoon. Garrett was at the kitchen table and Agnes was at the stove, and Lily was in the backyard, where Agnes had set up a small space with a blanket and a basket of things to occupy a child on a mild October afternoon. Colt stood at the kitchen window and watched Lily for a moment before going inside. She was drawing on a piece of paper from the basket. He could not see what she was drawing from this angle, but the motion of her arm was deliberate, the focused work of a child who was making something specific rather than scribbling. Her head was bent and her hair was loose around her face, and she had the rabbit on the blanket beside her propped against the basket, oriented as if it were watching. She looked from the kitchen window on a Thursday afternoon in October, like a child who was home. Colt went inside. He told Agnes and Garrett what Renata had said about the emergency order. Agnes absorbed it without visible alarm. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "There's something else," Colt said. He put his phone on the table and showed them the photograph he had taken of the guardianship transfer document, the one prepared and waiting in Sylvia's desk drawer. He watched Garrett look at it and watched Garrett's face do the thing faces did when the full scope of something became visible all at once. "She was preparing to take over Lily's guardianship," Colt said. "Legally. And if you had signed that document, Garrett, she would have had everything she needed. The child, the insurance trust, and a paper trail that made it look like you gave it all over voluntarily." Garrett looked at the photograph for a long time. "I almost signed it," Garrett said. "The version of it she described to me. I almost said yes because I thought maybe she was right." He didn't look up from the phone. "That I wasn't good enough for Lily. That Lily deserved something better than what I could give her." Colt looked at him. "You didn't sign it," he said. "No," Garrett said. "Then that's what matters now." He spent the evening organizing. Agnes's kitchen table became the workspace. He laid out everything he had. The physical documents they had photographed, the audio recording, the messages, Agnes's written medical observations. His own written account of finding Lily on the night of October 14th, which he wrote in the same plain declarative sentences he used for everything, stating what he had observed in the sequence. He had observed it. He had never prepared legal documents before. He had never had reason to. He had been on the wrong side of legal documents most of his adult life. The subject of them, rather than the author. He had always assumed this was a fixed condition, one of the permanent arrangements between the kind of person he was and the kind of system that existed around him. Renata walked him through the structure over the phone in 2 long calls, explaining what each piece of evidence was doing, what argument it supported where it sat, in the sequence of things a judge would need to consider. She was patient in a way that was not condescending, patient in the way of someone who understood that intelligence and education were not the same thing, and who was not interested in treating them as if they were. He organized the materials into sections. Agnes printed things when printing was needed. Garrett provided clarifications when Colt needed to confirm specific dates or conversations. At 9:30 that evening, Renata called again, and her voice was different. "The emergency order came through," she said. "Signed about an hour ago." She paused. "Judge Haverford." Colt didn't know the name. "He's on the board of a nonprofit that received a substantial donation from Aldrich and Park's Charitable Foundation last year," Renata said. "I've filed an immediate motion to stay. I've also filed a request for emergency evidentiary hearing citing specific documented concerns about the child's safety in the proposed custody arrangement." She paused again. We have 48 hours before that order has to be executed or successfully challenged. The hearing is scheduled for Friday morning at 9. That was 41 hours. Colt sat with that number for a moment. He thanked her and ended the call and looked at the kitchen table covered in organized evidence and thought about what 41 hours meant and what needed to happen in each of them. Then he went to tell Agnes and Garrett. They sat at the table, the three of them, and Colt walked through it. Agnes listened and nodded at intervals with the focused attention of a nurse in a briefing recording and processing. Garrett listened with his hands flat on the table, the posture of a man who had been told difficult things in his life and had learned to receive them without movement. "This isn't over," Colt said. "But the shape of it is clearer now. We know what we're walking into tomorrow, and we know what we have." He looked at both of them. What we have is enough. It has to be. After Agnes and Garrett had gone to their respective rooms, Colt sat at the kitchen table alone. He went through the organized materials one more time, not looking for something new. Looking at what was there, testing the structure of it, checking the gaps, the way you walked the perimeter of something before you left it for the night. The insurance motive. Sylvia's own words in the messages to Garrett describing the financial arrangement she proposed, which were not the words of a caretaker trying to find the best outcome for a child. They were the words of a woman who had identified a financial opportunity and had spent months working toward it methodically. The journal. Her own documentation of the things she had done written in the language of someone who believed she was right. That was in some ways the most damning piece of all, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it removed the possibility of accident or misunderstanding. You did not write down the things you believed you were right to do unless you intended to do them again. Agnes's medical documentation. 30 years of ER nursing behind every observation, every estimate of injury age, every clinical term applied to what she had seen on Lily's body. The kind of testimony that stood up because it came from a person who had spent a career making exactly these kinds of observations in exactly these kinds of situations. The video from the window, not proof of what had been done to Lily, proof that what Sylvia showed the world and what she was in private were not the same thing, which was the foundation of everything else. It was not a perfect case. Perfect cases existed in legal dramas. Real situations had gaps and ambiguities, and the specific risks that came from operating in a system where relationships and reputations functioned as a kind of parallel currency. Sylvia had accumulated a lot of that currency. They were going to walk into a courtroom with documentation and testimony against a woman who had spent years building a fortress out of other people's good opinions of her. Colt knew something about walking into difficult rooms. He got up from the table and checked on Lily. She was asleep in the small room Agnes had prepared for her. The room with the yellow curtains and the soft rug that Agnes had explained was left over from when her grandchildren visited, and she had simply never taken it up. Lily was on her side, the rabbit tucked under her arm, her breathing even and deep. The bruise on her cheek had faded to almost nothing. The bandaging on her wrists would come off in 2 more days, Agnes had said. Colt stood in the doorway and looked at her. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest, the pocket where he kept things he needed close, and took out the photograph he carried there. It was the same size as a wallet photograph. The corners, worn from handling the image, slightly faded from years of being carried in a pocket. Sarah, at 3 years old, sitting on the steps of the house in Knoxville, squinting into the sun with the expression she always had when she was thinking about something she wasn't quite ready to share yet. He could not look at this photograph without feeling the quality of absence that it represented. Not just her absence from the world, but his absence from her life. The years between them that had always been slightly less than they should have been, always slightly compromised by his choices and their consequences. He looked at the photograph, and then he looked at Lily sleeping in the yellow-curtained room. He had not been there when Sarah needed him. He was here now. He was going to stay here. He was going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow with everything he had built on Agnes's kitchen table. And he was going to be the version of himself that had been trying to exist since he pulled over on Highway 9 on a Wednesday night in October. He put the photograph back in his pocket. He went to the couch and sat down and closed his eyes and waited for morning. The courtroom smelled of old wood and fluorescent lighting and the specific tension that accumulated in spaces where people came to have things decided about them. Colt arrived 40 minutes early. He sat in the hard-back chair at the respondent's table and looked at the room and let himself get familiar with it, the way he got familiar with any space he was about to operate in. High ceilings. 2 windows on the east wall with the morning light coming through at a shallow angle. The judge's bench elevated at the front. The gallery behind him empty for now. The bailiff near the side door, a man in his 50s who had the posture of someone who had stood in this room for a long time and had stopped seeing it. Renata Haynes arrived at 8:45 with a leather briefcase and the focused calm of someone who had done this before and had made a specific decision that morning to be the steadiest thing in the room. She sat beside Colt and went through the materials once more, not because she needed to, Colt understood, but because the going through was itself a form of preparation, a way of moving through the door again before you had to walk through it for real. Agnes was in the gallery. She had dressed carefully, the way someone dressed when they intended to be taken seriously, and she had brought her documentation folder printed and organized in the sequence Renata had specified. She sat in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not look anxious. She looked like someone waiting for a procedure to begin that she had performed many times before in different contexts. Garrett was not there. This had been Renata's call. Garrett's presence, she had explained the night before, gave Sylvia's attorney a target. His record, his appearance, his history were all things that could be used to redirect attention away from the evidence and toward a narrative about who was fit to care for a child. Without Garrett in the room, that narrative had nowhere to land. She would represent his interests as secondary petitioner. He would come later when it was appropriate. Garrett had understood. He had looked at Colt when Renata said it, and Colt had given him a single nod, the kind that contained more than it showed, and Garrett had gone back to Agnes's house. Sylvia Mercer arrived at 8:50. She walked into the courtroom with her attorney, a man named Caldwell, who wore a suit that announced its own quality quietly, the way things that cost a great deal did not need to announce themselves loudly. Sylvia was composed. She was dressed in the same register she always occupied in public professional, and warm and chosen with care. She sat at the opposing table and opened a leather portfolio and did not look at Colt. Her not looking at him was a decision. He noticed it the way he noticed all decisions. The bailiff called the room to order and Judge Patricia Voss entered. Colt had done what he could to learn about Patricia Voss in the hours between Renata's call the night before and this morning. She was 61 years old, had been on the family court bench for 14 years, had a reputation among the attorneys who appeared before her for impatience with performance and direct engagement with substance. She was not on any board associated with Aldrich and Park. She had no documented relationship with any entity connected to Sylvia Mercer. This was not the judge who had signed the emergency order. That had been Judge Haverford. Renata had managed the reassignment through a procedural motion filed at 6 in the morning. leveraging a conflict of interest provision that was narrow but applicable. Colt did not ask how she had known to use it. He understood that this was what Renata's years of practice had built in her, the knowledge of which tools existed and which moment required which one. Judge Voss settled behind the bench and looked at the room with the efficient attention of someone who wasted nothing. Not time, not words, not the specific currency of a judge's attention. She had reviewed the filings, she said. She had reviewed the emergency custody order and the motion to stay and the request for evidentiary hearing. She had reviewed the initial complaint and the counter documentation provided by respondent's counsel. She said all of this in the flat declarative register of a person describing what existed rather than how they felt about it. Then she asked Caldwell to present. Caldwell presented well. He had the practiced fluency of a man who had spent decades turning complicated situations into simple narratives for the benefit of people who needed to make decisions quickly. The narrative he built was clean. A child left without parents in a car accident 8 months prior. The mother's brother, Garrett Briley, obtaining legal guardianship, a man with a documented history of violence and substance abuse. The child coming to the attention of Ms. Mercer, who had shared a home with Mr. Briley and had observed the conditions in which the child was being raised. Ms. Mercer's documented attempts to provide stability for the child. And then the alarming development of Wednesday night when an unknown individual had apparently taken the child from the home without authorization. He used the phrase "without authorization" carefully, the way a surgeon used a scalpel, placing it exactly where it would do the most work. He described Colt's Hells Angels affiliation in the manner of someone noting an objective fact. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. He simply placed the words Hells Angels and child in the same sentence and allowed the association to do what associations did. He asked the court to execute the emergency order and return the child to Ms. Mercer's care immediately. Then it was Renata's turn. She stood and she said that the respondent appreciated the court's time and intended to present documentary evidence that materially changed the character of what had been described. She said it in 4 sentences and sat back down. Judge Voss looked at her for a moment and then she said, "Let's see it." What followed was 2 hours that Colt experienced with the attention he had developed over a lifetime of operating in situations where the details mattered, and the margin for error was narrow. Renata presented the evidence in the sequence they had built it, moving from Agnes's medical documentation outward, establishing the foundation of Lily's injuries before moving to the question of their origin. Agnes was called to testify. She described her qualifications and her examination of Lily in the same plain, clinical language she had used when she wrote her documentation, which had the effect of making each finding sound like a thing observed rather than a thing argued. When Caldwell cross-examined her, he questioned her credentials and her involvement with Colt, which were fair questions, and she answered them in the same plain, clinical language, which had the further effect of making his questioning seem like the argumentative one, and her testimony seem like the neutral one. The messages from Garrett's phone were presented as a printed exhibit. Renata read the relevant portions aloud, not dramatically at the same even pace she used for everything, which was the right way to read evidence that was already dramatic enough on its own terms. The financial arrangement Sylvia had proposed. The description of the transfer document waiting for Garrett's signature. The timeline placing the proposal 3 days before the night of October 14th. Caldwell objected to the messages on authenticity grounds. Renata had anticipated this and produced the metadata documentation from the carrier. Judge Voss looked at it and overruled the objection and asked Renata to continue. The notebook excerpts were presented next. Renata read 3 passages. She had selected them carefully, choosing not the most extreme entries, but the most revealing ones the passages where Sylvia's own language established her framing of the child as a problem to be corrected, rather than a person to be cared for. The entries were dated and specific, and they were in Sylvia's handwriting, which Caldwell could not dispute because the notebook was a physical object, and the handwriting could be verified. Caldwell objected to the manner in which the notebook had been obtained. Renata said that Garrett Briley had lawful access to the property by virtue of a key he had retained from the period of his cohabitation, that no lock had been forced, that no property had been damaged, that the notebook had been observed and photographed, but not removed. Judge Voss asked Caldwell if he disputed that Garrett Briley had retained a key to the property. Caldwell conferred with Sylvia in a low voice for 15 seconds. Then he said he did not dispute it. The objection was overruled. Colt sat through all of this without moving more than was required of him, without speaking, except when Renata asked him to confirm specific points for the record, which she did twice. He looked at the judge when he spoke, and he answered what was asked, and he did not add anything that had not been requested, which was a discipline he had developed over years of understanding that in certain rooms what you did not say was as important as what you did. Then Caldwell stood and asked the court for permission to make a direct examination of Colt Danner. Renata made a brief objection on scope. Judge Voss considered it for 3 seconds and said she would allow limited examination. Caldwell approached. He was smooth about it. He began with straightforward questions about how Colt had come to find Lily, which Colt answered without elaboration. And then he moved as Colt had known he would move to the question of Colt's background, his history, his affiliation with the Hells Angels, the nature of that organization and its documented history with law enforcement, and whether Colt believed a child's best interests were served by being placed in the care of a man whose associations included the things his associations included. He delivered the question in a tone of genuine inquiry, which was the most effective way to deliver a question designed to harm. Colt was quiet for a moment, not because he did not know what to say. He had been waiting for this question. He had known from the moment Agnes had pulled the emergency custody order from the fax machine the night before that this question was coming, and he had decided in the early hours of the morning, lying on Agnes's couch in the dark, what his answer was going to be. He was not going to defend his affiliation. He was not going to explain the complexity of an organization that the law had spent decades characterizing in one way, and that the men inside it had experienced in other ways. That was a conversation for a different room and a different day. He was going to say the true thing instead. He looked at Caldwell, and then he looked at Judge Voss, because what he was about to say was for the judge, not for the attorney. He said, "I had a daughter. Her name was Sarah. She was 4 years old when she died in a car accident in Knoxville 5 years ago." The room was quiet. He said, "I was in Reno when it happened. I was there for reasons related to the club, yes. I was 3 states away from my daughter on the day she needed me." He paused for a moment, not for effect, but because this was the first time he had said these words in a public room with people listening, and the words required the weight that weight required. "I have spent 5 years understanding what it means to not be there when you should be." He said, "On the night of October 14th, I was driving alone on Highway 9 outside this town. I almost did not stop." He looked at the judge steadily. 200 other vehicles had passed that stretch of road before I did. I stopped because something in me was not willing to be the man who drove past anymore. That is the only answer I have to your question. I cannot offer you a clean history or a respectable affiliation. I can tell you that I found that child, and I did not leave her there, and I have not left her since. That is what I know how to offer." Caldwell had not moved during this. He looked at his notes for a moment, and then he looked at Judge Voss and said he had no further questions. Judge Voss looked at Colt for a long moment. Her expression was judicial, which was to say it was controlled in a way that told you nothing about what she was thinking and everything about the fact that she was thinking carefully. She asked Renata if there was anything further. Renata said there was one additional matter she wished to raise. She said that in accordance with established family court protocols, she was requesting that the court conduct a brief private interview with the child Lily Briley in chambers, given that Lily was of an age at which her expressed preferences were considered relevant by the court. Caldwell objected. He argued that the child was 5 years old and that a 5-year-old's expressed preferences could not be considered reliable indicators of her best interests, that children were susceptible to coaching and influence, and that the current circumstances in which Lily had been in the unofficial care of an unauthorized adult for 3 days were precisely the kind of circumstances in which coaching was most likely to have occurred. Judge Voss heard the objection and considered it for longer than she had considered the previous ones. Then she said that the court had discretion in this matter, and that she was exercising it. She said the interview would be conducted in chambers with a court-appointed child advocate present, and that it would not be recorded. She said that the results of the interview would inform but not determine her decision. She called a 15-minute recess. Renata had not looked at Colt during this exchange. She looked at him now, briefly, with the expression of someone who had done what they could do and had passed the work to a room she could not enter. He thought about Lily. He thought about the way she had held his hand on the first night, the fragility of her fingers around his, and the way she had said, "Not Uncle Garrett, Aunt Sylvia," with the flat calm of a person for whom certain truths had long since stopped being surprising and had simply become the architecture of her days. He thought about the afternoon she had drawn the picture of the house with the 2 figures in front of it, and the sun with too many rays, and had told him quietly, without looking up from the paper, that she liked it there. She had not been coached. She had been kept safe for 3 days in a room with yellow curtains and a stuffed rabbit, and an old woman who had handed her warm soup and a blanket and asked her no questions. She was not ready to answer. Whatever Lily told the judge in that room was going to be what Lily actually thought and felt, filtered through the vocabulary of a 5-year-old, and shaped by nothing more than her own experience. He trusted her. The 15 minutes passed the way that periods of waiting passed when you had done everything that could be done and were now in the condition of waiting for the world to respond to it. Agnes came from the gallery and sat beside Colt at the table. She did not say anything. She put her hand briefly on the back of his hand and then folded her hands in her lap and waited with him. This was one of the things about Agnes that he had never been able to find a way to be ungrateful for. She understood the difference between the silences that needed to be filled and the ones that needed to be inhabited. At the opposing table, Caldwell was speaking quietly to Sylvia. Sylvia was listening with the composed attention she brought to every observable moment. She had been composed through all of it, through the medical documentation and the notebook and the messages. She had looked at evidence that detailed her own actions, and she had remained composed because she had spent years making composure. Her armor, once built and worn long enough, did not come off easily just because the situation had changed. But she had looked once at the passage Renata read from the notebook. Just once, for less than 2 seconds, before her attorney put a hand briefly on her forearm, and she had settled back into the composed expression. Colt had watched it happen. Judge Voss returned to the bench 23 minutes after she had left it. She settled into her chair and looked at the room and was quiet for a moment in the way of a person arranging what they were going to say before they said it. She said she had spoken with the child. She said the child was articulate and responsive and had demonstrated an understanding of her situation that the court found notable given her age. She said the court had heard from the child directly, and the court had taken what the child said seriously. She said she was prepared to rule. Caldwell straightened slightly. Sylvia's hands were flat on the portfolio in front of her. Judge Voss said, "This court finds that the documentary and testimonial evidence presented today establishes a credible and substantiated concern regarding the safety of the minor child, Lily Briley, in the care of the petitioner, Sylvia Mercer." She said it in the level tone of a judge reading a ruling which gave the words their full weight precisely because nothing in the delivery inflated them. She said, "The emergency custody order executed yesterday is hereby stayed. Temporary guardianship of Lily Briley is granted jointly to Colt Danner and Garrett Briley, to be revisited at a full hearing within 60 days. All documentary evidence submitted today regarding the petitioner's conduct is referred to the County District Attorney's Office for review. Ms. Mercer, you are ordered to have no contact with the minor child pending the outcome of that review. Violation of this order will result in immediate further proceedings." The gavel came down. Renata exhaled beside him, not dramatically, just the small controlled release of someone who had been holding something for a long time and was now permitted to put a portion of it down. Colt sat still for a moment. He heard Caldwell speaking quietly to Sylvia. He heard chairs moving. He did not look at the opposing table. He was looking at the judge's bench, at the seal on the wall behind it, at the quality of the morning light coming through the east windows. Then he stood. He was turning toward the gallery when he felt it, rather than heard it. A stillness in the air immediately to his left. The stillness of someone who had stopped moving and was waiting for him to acknowledge it. He turned. Sylvia was standing 3 feet away. Caldwell was behind her with his hand half raised in a gesture that suggested he had advised against this and been ignored. Her composure was intact. It was always intact. It was the thing she had built first and maintained longest, and it was still there, still functioning, still holding the mask in place, even now when the mask had been systematically dismantled in front of a judge for 2 hours. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, which was assessingly with the gaze of someone who was always calculating the next position, even from the current one. She said, "This isn't over." Colt looked at her. He had thought in the various ways he had anticipated this moment, that there would be something he felt when it arrived. Anger which had been present in him for days, or satisfaction, which he had been told would come, but which he distrusted, or the cold clarity he had felt in physical confrontations when the situation resolved itself into simple mechanics. He felt none of those things. He felt something quieter and more permanent. The feeling of a man who had done what needed doing and had no further use for the drama of the thing. He said, "You're right." He held her gaze for a moment. "But you're done." She looked at him for another second. Then Caldwell put his hand on her arm, and she allowed herself to be guided toward the courtroom door, and Colt watched her go with the same attention he had used to watch her all week, reading the observable surface for information. And what he observed was the quality of a composure that was now performing entirely for its own benefit, because there was no longer any audience it could influence. Then he turned back toward the gallery where Agnes was already on her feet. Renata shook his hand and told him this was not over, that the 60-day review was real and would require continued preparation, that the DA referral would take time, and the outcome was not guaranteed. She told him all of this because it was true, and because she was the kind of attorney who told you the truth about what was still ahead. He listened to all of it and thanked her and meant it in the way you thank people who had done something real for you, and not just something required. Agnes hugged him in the hallway, which was not something he had been anticipating, and which therefore landed with the full force of something unexpected. She was small and strong, and she held on for a moment, and then she stepped back and looked at his face, and she said, "Good. Now let's go get that girl." He called Garrett from the courthouse steps. He told him what had happened in 4 sentences. Garrett was quiet on the other end for longer than those sentences required. Then he said, "I'll be there." He drove to Agnes's house. He parked in the driveway and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the silence that came after something had been resolved, but before the resolution had been fully absorbed. The oak tree in Agnes's yard had lost most of its leaves in the past 3 days, October having moved along at its own pace, regardless of what had been happening in courtrooms and kitchens and spare rooms with yellow curtains. The remaining leaves moved in the light wind with the dry sound of things that had completed their purpose and were in the last stage of it. He got out of the truck. The front door opened before he reached the porch steps, and Lily was standing in the doorway in the outfit she had been wearing when he left that morning, the purple shirt Agnes had produced from somewhere, and the jeans they had bought from the dollar store 2 days before, because she had nothing that fit. She had the rabbit under one arm, and she was looking at him with the expression she used when she was waiting for information she needed. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He said, "You're not going back to Sylvia's house." She looked at him. He said, "You're staying here for now, and then you'll come home with me." He paused. "You and Garrett both." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped forward down the porch steps, and she walked to him, and she put her arms around him and pressed her face against his chest. And Colt stood in Agnes Whitfield's driveway in Grayfield, Tennessee, on a Friday morning in October, with a 5-year-old wrapped around him, and he put one hand on the back of her head and held on. He had been on the wrong side of an anniversary for 5 years. He was on a different side of it now. He had not lost anything he had lost. He understood that. The space in him where Sarah had been was still the size and shape of Sarah. And it would remain that way because that was how loss worked. When it was the permanent kind. The kind that did not diminish with time, so much as it became familiar. Became something you learned to carry, rather than something you kept trying to put down. He was not naive about what he was carrying. And he was not going to pretend that this child in his arms was a replacement for something that could not be replaced. But he also understood something he had not understood on the night 5 years ago, when the call had come through from Knoxville. He understood now that the carrying did not prevent the doing. He understood that you could hold all of the weight of what had been and still have something left for what was in front of you. He had not understood that on the night of Sarah's death, or in the months after it, or in the years he had spent on the road trying to outrun what he could not outrun. He understood it now. Lily pulled back and looked up at him, and she said, "What happens next?" He said, "We take things one step at a time." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "All right," she said. That evening, they ate at Agnes's kitchen table, the 4 of them, Agnes and Garrett and Lily and Colt, with food Agnes had been preparing since mid-afternoon, when Renata had called to pass along the ruling. It was not a celebratory meal. in the way that films depicted celebratory meals with toasts and exclamations and the explicit naming of the thing being celebrated. It was quieter than that. It was a meal eaten by people who had been through something and were now on the other side of it and needed the simple fact of sitting at a table together more than they needed to talk about what the sitting meant. Lily ate without watching her plate the way she had in the first days, without the vigilance of a child who had learned that food could be conditional. She ate and she listened to the adults around her. And occasionally she asked a question that was direct and specific in the way of a child who had decided that asking questions was permitted. She asked Agnes how long she had lived in this house. She asked Garrett if he still had the photograph of her parents that used to be on the mantel at Meridian Road. She asked Colt what his dog was called. He said he did not have a dog. She said he should get one. He said he would think about it. After dinner, after Lily had been settled for the night with the rabbit and the yellow curtains pulled against the dark, and Agnes's reading lamp making its warm circle in the hallway, Colt went out to the back porch. He heard the back door open behind him, and then Garrett came out and stood at the railing beside him. They were both quiet for a while. Then Garrett said, "I've been thinking about what you said. In there. About Sarah." Colt looked at the dark yard. "I didn't know you had a daughter," Garrett said. He said it carefully, the way you said things when you knew they had weight and you were trying to carry them correctly. Colt didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, "I don't talk about it much." Garrett nodded. "You didn't have to say it in there," Garrett said. "In the courtroom. You didn't have to give them that." Colt looked at the dark beyond the porch light's reach. At the trees he could just make out at the edge of the yard, their shapes solid and patient. "Yes, I did," he said. Garrett was quiet. Colt said, "I spent 5 years thinking what happened to Sarah was something I had to keep in a separate place from the rest of my life. Like it was too big to bring into a room and let people see." He paused. But keeping it separate just made it heavier. He said it without drama in the plain, matter-of-fact register that was the only register he trusted for things that mattered. You can't carry weight by not looking at it. Garrett looked at the yard. "She's going to be okay," Garrett said. It was not a question. Colt said, "She's already more okay than she was 5 days ago." He paused. "She's going to keep getting more okay. That's what they do." He thought about the picture she had drawn at Agnes's kitchen table, the house with 2 stick figures in front of it, and the sun with too many rays. Kids do that. They build. Garrett was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Thank you for not walking past." Colt said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't able to do that anymore." They stood on the porch in the October night, and the crickets did what crickets did, and the porch light made its small, warm circle. And inside the house, Agnes had turned on the radio in the kitchen. Something quiet. An old song that neither of them recognized, but that sounded like it came from a time when people made things that lasted. The story of what happened to Sylvia Mercer unfolded over the months that followed with the pace of legal processes, which was not the pace of films or satisfying narratives, but the pace of institutional mechanisms working through their procedures in the order their procedures required. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation in November. The insurance fraud component moved faster than the child endangerment charges, because financial crimes had cleaner evidentiary standards, and the documentary trail was substantial. In February, a grand jury returned an indictment on 6 counts. By spring, the total count had grown to 14 as investigators worked through the full scope of what Sylvia had built. and what it had cost. Caldwell withdrew from the case in December, which told its own story. Sylvia's name was removed from the employee directory at Aldrich and Park. The same week, the indictment was made public. The charitable foundation that had funded Judge Haverford's nonprofit received a letter from the foundation board noting a conflict of interest review. That review was still ongoing the last time Renata mentioned it. None of this was fast. None of it was clean. The legal process was what the legal process was, which was to say that it was slow and procedural, and not particularly interested in the emotional arcs of the people caught in its machinery. Colt had never expected it to be otherwise. He had spent too many years on the wrong side of that machinery to romanticize it. But it moved, which was what mattered. It moved in the direction it was supposed to move, and it kept moving. The 60-day review hearing resulted in formal joint guardianship for Colt and Garrett. Renata had prepared extensively and presented cleanly, and Judge Voss, who had been assigned the matter through reassignment, had ruled without apparent hesitation. The child advocate who had interviewed Lily for the first hearing submitted a written assessment that described Lily's expressed preferences and current condition in clinical language that was unambiguous about what it meant. Garrett moved to a different house on the east side of Grayfield. 3 rooms on a quiet street, with a small yard rented from a woman who had known his family before the difficulties of recent years, and who had decided after speaking with Agnes and with Renata, and once briefly with Colt, that character was a thing you observed over time, and that what she had observed over the last several months was sufficient. He planted a small garden in the spring. Lily helped him plant the tomatoes on a Saturday when Colt brought her over, and she narrated the process of putting each seedling into the ground with the authority of a child who has recently learned something and considers it important to share. Colt's house was the primary residence. He had spent 3 weeks before the 60-day hearing making it right, which involved more specific decisions than he had anticipated, and which Agnes helped him navigate with the same focused competence she brought to everything. A proper bed. Curtains that were not what you chose for yourself, but what a child's room needed to feel like a place where she could be fully herself. A bookcase. Art supplies because Lily drew every day. Now her pictures still containing the vocabulary of a child working things out through color and form, but lighter in their subject matter, more open in their composition, increasingly populated by details that had not appeared in the early drawings. She drew their dog. She had been persistent about the dog. Colt had gotten the dog in December, a medium-sized mixed breed from the county shelter. Brown and white with one ear that stood up and one that folded over, approximately 2 years old, with the energy of a dog that had been waiting for something and had finally found it. Lily had named him immediately and without consultation, and the name she gave him was not the name Colt would have chosen, but it was the name the dog had now, and it suited him. On a Saturday afternoon in early spring, Colt drove to the park on the east side of town. The park had a long, flat section of grass, and then a play structure, and then a path along the creek that stayed in shade for most of the day. He brought the dog, and Lily and Garrett met them there at noon with the punctuality that Garrett had been developing the small, consistent demonstrations of presence that were their own kind of testimony. The afternoon was warm and clear, the kind of day that arrived in Tennessee in April, like a promise being kept. The light was the gold of late afternoon on new grass, and Lily moved through it with the energy of a child who had somewhere to be and did not need a reason for it. She ran. She ran with the dog and with the other children who were at the park, and she fell twice on the grass and got back up both times without pausing to assess whether getting back up was the right choice. She came to where Colt was sitting on the bench along the path, and told him something about the other children, a piece of social information she was still deciding what to do with, and he listened to it with the full attention she deserved, and she ran back. Garrett sat beside him on the bench. They watched her run. Colt reached into his inside jacket pocket. He took out the photograph. The corners were worn. The image was slightly faded. Sarah, at 3 years old, sitting on the steps of the house in Knoxville, squinting into the sun, with the expression she always had when she was thinking about something she was not quite ready to share. He looked at it for a long moment. He had been carrying this photograph in his inside pocket for 5 years. He had carried it the way some men carried a wound. Not to remember it, he did not need a photograph to remember, but to have the physical fact of it close to him, to feel the weight of it against his chest, which had been his way of not walking away from what he carried, of insisting on his own accountability for the thing he had not been there for. He thought about Sarah. He thought about her the way he always thought about her, which was completely, which was with the full understanding of who she had been and what she had meant and what her absence cost. That had not changed. He did not expect it to change. He was not looking for it to change. He thought about what he had said in the courtroom. He thought about what it had cost to say it, and what it had done not just in terms of the ruling, but in terms of himself. There was something that had moved when he said those words out loud in that room, something that had been in a closed position, and had opened not dramatically, not with any sensation of release, but plainly and completely the way a door opened when someone finally used it. He looked at the photograph one more time. Then he looked at Lily running across the grass, with the dog, her arms going, her hair catching the afternoon light, her laugh carrying across the open space between the trees, a clear, bright sound that had not existed 10 days before. He found her, and that now existed every day. He did not put the photograph back in his pocket. He held it for another moment, and then he set it down on the bench beside him. He was not putting it away. He was not letting go of Sarah, or the weight of what he owed her memory. He understood the difference between putting something down and abandoning it. You put something down when you no longer needed to grip it, to know it was yours. When you had stopped confusing the holding with the honoring. He put it down. The afternoon light moved across the grass. The dog barked once at a bird that had made the error of landing nearby, and then abandoned the bark and went back to running with Lily. Garrett looked at the photograph on the bench and then at Colt, and he did not say anything, which was the right thing. Colt looked at the park and the light and the child running in it. He had stopped on Highway 9 on a Wednesday night in October, because something in him was not willing to be the man who drove past anymore. He had stayed because staying was what was required. He was here now on a bench in the afternoon light with a dog and a child, and a man who was becoming something like family in the slow way that families made themselves out of the materials available when the conventional ones were not enough. He was here. And he was going to keep being here because that was the only thing he had to offer that was worth anything. And it turned out he had found that it was enough. Lily came running toward him across the grass, the dog at her heels, her face open and bright and fully present in the way of children who have been given back the permission to simply be where they are. She stopped in front of him and looked at him with those eyes that had read him from the beginning. She said, "Are you okay?" He looked at her. He said, "Yeah, kid, I'm okay." She seemed to find this satisfactory. She looked down at the photograph on the bench, and she did not ask about it. She picked it up and held it carefully, looking at the small face in it, and then she handed it back to him without a word. And he took it, and he held it in his hand for a moment, and then he put it in his shirt pocket, close but not locked, carried but not gripped. Lily ran back to the dog. The afternoon continued.